Norman, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be here again. I hope we have both learned a lot. I want to thank my two hosts, the Campus Studies Institute and the associated students, for your act of faith. Somebody wrote me anonymously from this campus a few days ago to tell me that I would not be as welcome as I was a year ago. I didn't quite know what to make out of that. The reason he or she, I don't know who it was who wrote the letter, advanced for the presumptive skepticism with which you would greet my remarks is, according to the letter, that I am now a certified member of the establishment. The reason I'm a certified member of the establishment, said the correspondent, who identified himself as a student here, is because I was appointed by the President as a member of the Advisory Commission on the USIA. Since I didn't have an opportunity to reply to that student, he not having given the return address or his name, I would like, if I may, to take just 2 seconds to say to him that if I had had an opportunity to reply, I would have said 2 things. One of them is that under the law, no more than 3 members of the commission, of which there are 5, may belong to the same political party, so that it doesn't follow that by mere membership in that commission you are necessarily an instrument of the president, point 1. And point 2, I would have said that when in fact I was asked if I would accept the appointment, I have to confess that I did so primarily because I looked forward to the certainty that Senator Fulbright would refuse to endorse me. To my great humiliation, he let my nomination go by, and in due course, I received the form commission that one receives in situations like this. So it's extremely pretty, and it says, Richard M. Nixon, President of the United States of America, etc., etc. And it has 4 blanks in it. The first blank is where they write in your name. The second blank is where is the military-industrial complex, to give me some more truth. The second blank is where they list the office to which you have been appointed. The third blank is the length of the appointment. And the fourth blank begins with a printed phrase which says, in recognition of, colon. And in my blank it said, his integrity and ability. I was very pleased that President Nixon knew about my integrity and ability, but in due course I found myself wondering what was the inventory of adjectives from which these two had been selected. The lawyers have a phrase, numero unius exclusio alterius, which is to say, that which you name implicitly excludes that which you don't name. A few months later, I was in Saigon talking with Mr. Bunker, and he was called out of the room. And as I sat there, my eyes roamed, and I saw his commission hanging on the wall, and I rushed over to see what was written on his blank space. And it said, in recognition of his integrity, ability, and prudence. The eyes of Nixon are upon you. We spoke a year ago about disorders in general. Since that time, my thought on the subject has, presumably like your own, advanced. And I'm here tonight to trade with you a few supplementary propositions to those exchanged a year ago. Looking forward especially to the question period, during which you can take the opportunity to make me more explicit. Proposition 1, the opinion-making community misunderstands the usefulness of what some people call repression. I mean by this proposition to draw attention to the great success that the recent mentors of American civilization have enjoyed when they suggest that repression is the kind of thing practiced only by stormtroopers and rationalized in Mein Kampf, or in other situations by such as Lester Maddox in his chicken restaurant driven by the furies of white supremacy. There is no evidence in early American history that I know of to suggest that the men who wrote the Constitution believed that all thought was in some way equal, simply because they did go on to devise a Bill of Rights that forbade Congress from enacting any laws abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. When Thomas Jefferson spoke about the virtue of tolerating even those who seek to repeal our republican forms of government, it seems clear to me from his other writings and from the lapidary record of his own activities that what he meant to say was that the toleration of certain kinds of dissent is a tribute to the success with which the majority of the people will always reject the blandishments of the anti-republican minority. It is, after all, a form of democratic self-indulgence to be able to stroll peacefully through Central Park and listen there to the orators who denounce our free institutions. It puts one in mind of the cozy children's dream of waking up suddenly in the jungle surrounded by wild beasts who, however, are powerless to harm you because you are surrounded by an impenetrable bubble of glass which is proof against their aggressions. Abraham Lincoln, as polemicist, pulled a fast one, Professor Harry Jaffer reminds us, when he began his Gettysburg Address by dating the beginning of the American Republic not with the Constitution but with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. His old adversary Stephen Douglas, during the famous debates, based his case on the Constitution alone, with exclusive reference to which it could indeed be argued that the Dred Scott decision was meticulously correct in forbidding the free soil states from refusing a slave owner the right to take residence there along with the slaves. Lincoln cited the beginning of the United States as having taken place 70 years before Gettysburg. That is to say, in 1776, with the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, accordingly, said Lincoln in effect, the metaphysics of the Declaration of Independence animate the Constitution, so that when scholars and statesmen disagreed, as for instance they did with progressive heat in the years that led to the explosion of civil war, on how to reconcile the postulates of America with the survival of slavery, it was to the Declaration of Independence that the abolitionists ideally repaired for guidance. Because the Declaration of Independence spoke of self-evident truths, among them that men are born equal, the initial toleration of slavery, in the understanding of Lincoln, was a historical accommodation. The accommodation of a great weight on America's neck, a birthmark, to be recognized by its leaders as such, so that step by step they might direct public policy towards emancipation by attrition. Professor Jaffer reminds us that, quote, no American statesman ever violated the ordinary maxims of civil liberties more than did Abraham Lincoln, and few seem to have been more careful of them than Jefferson Davis. And then he adds the point which is so striking in the contemporary situation: yet the cause for the sake of which the one slighted these maxims was human freedom, while the other, claiming to defend the forms of constitutional government, found in those forms a ground for defending and preserving human slavery. It is instructive to meditate on this apparent paradox at a moment when so much of the liberal community is disposed to denounce such modest efforts as are nowadays being made to enhance the public order. Proposition 2. The absolutizers, in their struggle against what they call repression, are doing their best to make the Constitution of the United States incoherent. It ought to be obvious that it is impossible to absolutize any single freedom without moving it into the way of another absolutized freedom. How can you simultaneously have an absolute right to compel testimony in your own behalf, Amendment 6, while others have the absolute right, Amendment 5, to refuse to testify lest they incriminate themselves? How can you have absolute freedom of the press, Amendment 1, alongside the absolute right to a fair trial, Amendment 6? How can you have absolute freedom of speech, Amendment 1, alongside other people's absolute right, Amendment 14, to their property, including their good name? Oliver Wendell Holmes, asked one time to define a fanatic, said something to this effect: look, everyone will agree it's a matter of common sense that a house owner owns the space above his roof, such that, for example, he can prevent his neighbor from constructing a perpendicular extension reaching out from his own house to overshadow his neighbors. The fanatic, on the other hand, will carry the argument forward absolutely. He will reason from his ownership of the space above his roof to ownership of a shaft of air that projects straight out into the heavenly spheres, such that no child's kite or supersonic transport can overfly him without written permission. It's ironic that it is to a famous dissent of the same Oliver Wendell Holmes that the absolutizers, which is to say the fanatics, turn when insisting that all ideas are to be treated with absolute impartiality. It was Justice Holmes who said, that, quotes, the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. If that maxim were accepted, white superiority would long since have been accepted as truth in parts of this and other countries. In any case, the statement is hard to reconcile with the notion that some truths are self-evident. Certainly it is hard to reconcile with the attitudes of the men who urged the adoption of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers stressed, among other things, the usefulness of a federal government in guaranteeing freedom within the individual states. Concerning the problem of indigenous threats to the Republic, Alexander Hamilton wrote most directly, his plea for the proposed Constitution was not merely a plea against the anarchy that every schoolboy knows he abhorred, because he knew also of the dangers of despotism. It is impossible to read the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy, he wrote, without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were kept in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. He went on to argue that historical advances in the science of government now permitted the granting of powers sufficient to avoid anarchy, yet insufficient to promote tyranny. But he did insist that the government must have the power necessary to make its laws obeyed. Such power, it might be argued, as the contemporary revolutionists and their fellow travelers are quick to ridicule, pleading an absolutized version of the Bill of Rights. Hamilton wrote, in criticism of the Articles of Confederation, that the government, as composed after the end of the Revolutionary War, had, quote, no powers to exact obedience or to punish disobedience to its resolutions, either by pecuniary mulcts or by a suspension or divestiture of privilege or by any other constitutional mode. Unless that situation were changed, he warned, the United States would afford, quote, the extraordinary spectacle of a government destitute even of the shadow of constitutional power to enforce the execution of its own laws. How much power should a government have in order to protect the Republic against insurrection? A very important question being fought out today in Congress, in the courts, in the colleges, among opinion makers. On this matter, the absolutists, in, for instance, the Americans of Liberties Union, feel perfectly at home with the old rigidities, but they are not winning all the constitutional debates. It is currently being tested, for instance, whether the government may punish those who, in the opinion of the court, conspired to go to Chicago in order to abridge the freedom of others to transact their business at the Democratic Convention in 1968. The question arises, is the act under which the Chicago Seven were tried and convicted constitutional? If we concede that the right to attempt to bring down the Republican forms of government is not absolute, either in theory or in the historical experience of America, does it follow that we are bound to indulge, let alone applaud, such expressions of public impatience as, for instance, are embodied in the 1968 Act, which was the basis for the prosecutions in Chicago during the winter? We come to Proposition 3. Such self-proclaimed revolutionists as Messrs. Hoffman, Rubin, Dellinger, and Seal, and such others as, for instance, Please save your applause till I read them all. And such others, for instance, as Tom Hayden and Stoughton Lynd, do not appear to understand the historical, let alone the theoretical rights of counter-revolutionists. In the beginning, for our contemporary revolutionists, it was the American Revolution. It is their polemical charter, the touchstone of their thought and action. It is as important to the defense of their dogma and to their behavior as prohibition is to the defense of the young pot smoker who says if the older generation could drink unconstitutional booze, why can't we smoke illegal grass? Revolutionists insist that this country was after all baptized in revolution, that revolution is genetically a part of the American way. I do not find anywhere in the informed literature of the period any suggestion that it was other than the accepted right of the British throne to resist the American Revolution. Edmund Burke, whose sympathies were plainly with us, never suggested that King George was violating any known canon of civilization by sending a large army to America to say no to the army of George Washington. And if Washington had been caught and hanged, Burke would no doubt have deplored excessive royal punctilio. But there was no higher law around to appeal to than had been available to Vercingetorix to use against Julius Caesar. By the same token, the United States is entitled by all conventional standards to hang its revolutionists. If then the contemporary revolutionists can find no historical right to revolt against our society under immunity from repression, but can they find any abstract right to commend their enterprise? Mr. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence acknowledges the, quote, right of the people to alter or abolish their government, and, quotes, to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The Declaration goes on to enumerate the grievances of the colonies. It is, as you know, a stirring catalogue, but it finally reduces to the matter of the source of power, i.e., who should rule. He, King George, has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, said the Declaration. Who is to decide what are the laws most wholesome and necessary for the public good? Why, the people. The people who were affected by those laws. The American Revolution was about who should rule. Everybody? Mr. Jefferson, perhaps from a sense of tact, perhaps even from a sense of cunning, introduces into the peroration of his manifesto a subtle distinction. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare. The good people of these colonies. A ritual obeisance or a sly recognition that there are plenty of colonials around who oppose secession, bad people. You see, Mr. Jefferson always acknowledged the existence of bad people in a way that Oliver Wendell Holmes had difficulty in doing, so absolute was his relativism. But Jefferson's rationalist faith in the inherent power of good ideas to defeat bad ideas in the marketplace, was ringingly proclaimed in his later years in his famous statement in which he said, "Those who wish to dissolve the Union or to change its republican form should stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it." It isn't, of course, suggested in this passage what is the indicated course of action if reason should fail in the performance of its delegated duty. But we do know from Jefferson's own autocratic habits that he often gave reason a helping hand, and we know from the Declaration of Independence that he dubbed some truths as self-evident, and derivatively that he judged those people who acknowledged those truths as good and those who did not as something else. It was also Jefferson, presumably in a more skeptical frame of mind about humankind, who wrote, "Let us hear no more of trust in man, but bind them down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution." From all of which one infers that in Jefferson's America, A, there is on some very basic points a right and a wrong position. That B, the probability is that the people will opt for the right position prodded by reason to do so. But that C, it sometimes becomes necessary to resist the bad people, whether they are numerous or whether they are simply the King of England. Abbie Hoffman is not the King of England. But the point, of course, is that he seeks a kind of metaphorical accession to the throne by the use of any means, and the corollary point in our troubled times is, shall we restrain him, A, and if so be, how, and C, how shall we protect not so much the White House from his occupation of it, but how shall we protect lesser folk than the President, you and me and the rest, from such a denial of our rights as Mr. Hoffman and his mini-legions are capable of denying this in their quixotic but not altogether toothless campaign for revolution. The Jeffersonian ideal continues to be exemplary. The Hoffmans and the Dellingers and the Cleavers should be laughed or disdained into impotence. But there is a creeping difference between, for instance, the way in which the whole of the American public reacted against the white racists who assaulted the civil rights advocates during the 60s, and the way in which the community reacts now to the disruptions of the New Left revolutionaries. Congressman Al Lowenstein recently told me that it was not a new experience for him to be silenced and even threatened and clubbed down by those who disagreed with him. But when he was given such treatment by Ku Klux types in the South in the early 60s, the whole of America reacted in horror and registered its solidarity with him and the others who worked for a continuing attrition of the birthmark that the Civil War did not succeed altogether in erasing. A few months ago, addressing a university audience at Columbia, New York, Mr. Lowenstein was hooted down and literally silenced for defending the right of Professor Herman Kahn to speak unmolested. And faculty members in that audience countenanced and even egged on the Jacobinical furies that ruled the crowd, who, needless to say, went unpunished, even unreprimanded, although they most indisputably conspired together to abridge the civil liberties of two men, Herman Kahn and Al Lowenstein, who have never by word or deed disparaged the civil liberties of any American citizen. Proposition 4. So far have the professionally tolerant gone toward fanaticism that we stand in danger of losing the salutary force of public sanction. It is always least desirable to write new laws, or to have to invoke old laws that have been flaccid from disuse. Consider now a recent incident. It blurs in your mind just what and who are the Black Panthers. Why, they are an organization founded a few years ago on the doctrine that the United States is a racist, oppressive country best dealt with by the elimination of its leaders and institutions. Suggestive of its rhetorical style is the front page of its house organ, which featured on the day after his death a photograph of Robert Kennedy lying in a pool of his own blood, his face transformed by the editor to the likeness of a pig. Do you think Robert Kennedy was a pig? I asked Eldridge Cleaver a while ago. Yes, he said. Did Cleaver believe in the elimination of pigs? Yes, he said. Well, I said, why not begin with Nixon? Surely he is the chief pig. Mr. Cleaver, who has had intimate experiences with the law, advised me that he knew enough not to counsel directly the assassination of the president, but that if in fact someone did kill him, that would simply be one less pig in the world.
I hate to interrupt you. There's an emergency.
Yeah.
I truly apologize for interrupting when he's in the midst of something, but is George Davis in the audience, or Ruth, his wife? Their son is ill, and nothing can be done with him at the moment unless he calls this number, 448-2510. It's Mr. Davis. He can come to the back of the stage. George Davis, 448-2510, or I'll give you the number here. Sorry.
Those who believe that Mr. Cleaver and derivatively the Panthers have mellowed since the assassination of Mr. Kennedy may look at the introduction Cleaver wrote to Jerry Rubin's new book, published by the august house of Simon & Schuster, putting us in mind of Lenin's comment that when the last of the bourgeois is hanged, a capitalist will sell the hangman the rope. In which introduction, Mr. Cleaver, an official of the Black Panthers, urges his disciples in America, black and white, to rise up, quote, and kill the pigs, and recalls as the most precious memory of his political experience in America a shootout in Oakland, California, at which he observed that after one salvo, quotes, a pig white lay dead, deep fried in the fat of his own bullshit. Mr. Cleaver is not in this country. His career as visiting professor at Berkeley having been interrupted by a parole court. We cannot confront him, so what do we do about the other Black Panthers of which he continues to be the spiritual leader? Why, if we are Leonard Bernstein, the conductor, we have a big cocktail party to which we invite a local representative of the party. Mr. Bernstein was apparently modishly dressed in turtleneck sweater and double-breasted jacket, and in pursuit of understanding had obviously been studying up on the idiom of the times. Indeed, so thorough is Mr. Bernstein that it is altogether possible that he staged a rehearsal or two, because a dialogue with the Black Panthers every bit as difficult to perform as a symphony of Schoenberg. Anyway, the Black Panther, Mr. Cox, began last January by announcing that if business didn't provide full employment, then the Panthers would simply take over the means of production and put them in the hands of the people, to which prescription it is recorded that Mr. Bernstein's reply was, quote, "I dig absolutely." Mr. Cox told the gathering how very pacific he and his Confederates are, that ultimately, of course, they desire peace, but that they have been attacked in their homes and murdered in their beds and have the right to defend themselves. I agree 100%, Mr. Bernstein said, neglecting to ask Mr. Cox to explain to what defensive uses his Confederates intended to put the hand grenades and Molotov cocktails that were discovered during those raids. One lady present, a wife of a Black Panther who was in jail on the charge of planning to kill a few pigs and conspiring to dynamite Midtown department stores, expressed great indignation at the interruption of her husband's activities by the courts, which had recently arrested 13 Panthers, holding 10 of them on $100,000 bail. She brought along her lawyer, who asked the distinguished gathering of artists, capitalists for donations. Someone who desired to be anonymous promised $7,500. Sheldon Harnick, the lyricist, came in with $250. Burton Lane, the composer, gave $200, and Mrs. Harry Belafonte $300. Mr. Bernstein said proudly that he would donate the proceeds from his very next concert. He is too shy a man to say how much he earns per concert, but he didn't want to appear teased, so he said that the sum would be in 4 figures. Bernstein approaches a singular contribution to ideological ecumenism. And no doubt Mr. Bernstein curses himself for having only just now discovered it. Only 2 years ago, he might have invited George Lincoln Rockwell and his Nazis into his apartment to ask them to explain the causes of their discontents, and raised a little money for those frequent occasions when Rockwell found himself on the shady side of the law. On the other hand, it isn't too late. There are surely still around enough members of the Ku Klux Klan to fill Mr. Bernstein's living room, or at least most of it. I remember in the hour I spent with Mr. Cleaver, the one thing I said to him that made him truly angry. It was that the Black Panther Party exists primarily for the gratification of white people. Surely the fact of its membership, so small in terms of the potential, is testimony primarily to its usefulness to those white people who like to strut their toleration and strip themselves of their turtleneck sweaters to reveal their shame. The Panthers have only a few thousand members because the mass of the black people are too proud, too unaffected to join the Panthers, to attend Leonard Bernstein's parties. Meanwhile, that party will serve, one hopes, forever as a symbol of true moral confusion, as a black mass on the altar of toleration. It suggests the failure of aristocratic public opinion to rise to elementary moral responsibilities. Suggesting Proposition 5, although such as Eldridge Cleaver can be extremely specific, kill the pigs, the vagueness of the revolutionary program of much of the New Left is its most singular strength, confronting the Republic with its subtlest challenge. It is a commonplace to observe that those of a rebellious spirit in our midst do not know what they want. and even that they do not know by what means to achieve the conditions they cannot specify. I consider these data rather less reassuring than otherwise. If the revolutionists were committed to an identifiable program, they might be approached or bombarded with demonstrations that their program or an approximation of it is not producing the goods in Cuba, say, or in the Soviet Union or in China. But precisely the de-ideologization of their movement, the disembodiment of the eschaton, the loose-jointedness of their approach, leaves them in a frame of mind at once romantic and diffuse. And the rest of us without the great weapon available to King Canute, when he was able to contrive what would nowadays be called a confrontation between the ineluctable laws of nature and the superstitious indulgences of his subjects. So that the idea of revolution continues to excite the political and moral imagination. What ails them? Or if you prefer, what ails the non-revolutionaries? I quote now, not from many of the better-known advocates of revolution. I reach, instead, for a stretch of prose, unencumbered by sophistication of thought or of style, what one might call the Volkswagen of revolutionary manifestos. Here it is from a professor of political science at Hunter College, New York City, published last spring in volume 1, number 1, of a, quote, revolutionary, unquote, journal. The established system, he says, quote, comprises elements of the archaic Judeo-Christian theocratic traditions, elements of the Dark Age autocracy, feudalism, militarism, zoological capitalism. I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but I have a feeling I'm one. Corporate monopolism and plutocracy with an admixture of 19th century liberalism and trade union socialism. Now there is no doubt that these are indeed some of the historical, cultural, and philosophical streams that flow into America. But now hear what the professor says that they have produced. They have produced, to begin with, an anti-social orientation based on the private profit motivation. This in turn has produced, quotes, most of the evils of the present system. Among those evils are the following: the transformation of man into an instrument of production, and indiscriminate exploitation of natural and human resources, the promotion of vulgarity and excessive consumption coexisting with poverty, the scarcity of housing, the pollution of air, water, and food, unemployment, urban decay, the reduction of woman to a sex symbol, crime, racial discrimination, and the transformation of universities into instruments of the military-industrial complex. Now one could pause to argue point by point with these allegations, which is time-consuming, as an alternative to simply dismissing the professor as an etiological simpleton. But it is not my purpose here to argue with the revolutionist the justice of his indictments or the merit of his solutions. It is all very well to take the revolutionists by the scruff of the neck and show them that, as Professor Toynbee preaches, revolutions historically have not brought about the ends explicitly desired, but something very like their opposite. But the success of such demonstrations presupposes a clinical curiosity on the part of the observer, and such is not the temper of those in America who are talking about revolution. The point to stress is that the allure of revolution and the importance of revolutionary attitudes in contemporary political affairs are bound to grow in the existing climate, and not only because these sanctions of stability are not being pressed, but precisely because every modern aggravation, as we have seen, is nowadays transformed into yet another cause for revolutionary commitment. And indeed, we have seen that the ideologists of revolution are careful, as in the passages above, to tread a line enough on the specific side of generality to describe a recognizably American situation, yet far enough short of specificity to permit them constantly to nourish the revolutionary imagination, to stimulate the confidence that liberation lies just over there on the other side of the barricades, even as Nat Turner dreamed that if only he could make it to the dismal swamp, the world would begin anew. There is very little hope in arguing with those who are attracted to the religion of revolution. James Baldwin, in his furious and moving polemic, The Fire Next Time, argued that, quotes, the only thing that Western civilization has that the black man should want is power.